All right, joining me from London is Royal United Services Institute Senior Fellow Darya Dolzikova. Darya, it's great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So you and our good friend, two-time Mucci Award-winning professor Justin Bronk just wrote this article at RUSI called "The Challenges Involved in Military Strikes Against Iran's Nuclear Program." And you guys misspelled program there. I don't know if you knew that. That's a little American joke. On our most recent episode here, we were talking about the military buildup in the region that the Americans have done in recent weeks, including now as we sit here, and this is late breaking news, as you can see by the US&I Fleet Tracker, the Vincent Strike Group is in the North Arabian Sea, joining the Harry S. Truman Strike Group, annotated here in the Red Sea. I'm not sure if they're still in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Aden or wherever, but the point is we have two carrier strike groups in the region joining the military buildup of B-2s and heavy tankers and things that have been put in that little black dot in the middle of the Indian Ocean, Diego Garcia, as well as A-10s, F-35s in Jordan. Let me play a quote from President Trump in recent weeks about his stance towards Iran.
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
So is that a yes?
You know, it's not a complicated formula. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's all there is.
That was before the talks that are now happening in Oman. As we speak, the Americans and Iranians are engaged in talks in Oman. Here's a tweet from the foreign minister of Oman who said, "I'm proud to announce that today in Muscat, we hosted Iranian Foreign Minister Dr. Sayed Abbas Araghchi and U.S. Presidential Envoy Steve Witkoff." He's been all over the world. He's a very busy guy these days, and mediated to begin a process of dialogue and negotiations with the shared aim of concluding a fair and binding agreement. So talk to us about what are some of the issues involved in these negotiations and potential American strikes against the nuclear facilities in Iran. Reporting on events around the Middle East is challenging because there are so many elements to any given story. So let me tell you about a resource that I depend on to get to the truth when covering current events: Ground News. Let's search the topic we're talking about in this episode using the general search term Iran. The first result is a good one about the talks in Oman between the U.S. and Iran. We click on it and you can see there are 643 stories around that topic. And this infographic here shows you the bias distribution with the logos of the sources prominently displayed. Let's compare two headlines. First one is Newsmax, which is owned by Christopher Ruddy, has mixed factuality and leans right. We click through to the story with the headline, "Iran and U.S. envoys hold first negotiation over Tehran's nuclear program and talk face-to-face." And we see this coverage shines a mostly positive light on the situation. And then we have this one here from Politico, which is owned by Capital News Company, with very high factuality and leans left. You can see the headline, "Witkoff spoke briefly with Iranian counterpart amid Trump's nuclear pressure campaign." And the write-up is a bit less sympathetic than the Newsmax article. You can't get this amount of information organized like this anywhere else. Go to ground.news/ward or scan the QR code on the screen. If you use my link, you can get 40% off unlimited access, which is the Vantage plan that I use. The link is in the episode description below, so check it out.
The Iranian nuclear program is so advanced at this point that the idea of fully eliminating Iran's capability to develop a nuclear weapon, to me, is not a practical starting point for negotiations. And I don't think that's actually really technically possible because it has quite advanced capabilities already in terms of uranium enrichment, some other activities that might be relevant to weaponization, but also it's developed quite an extensive base of latent expertise, latent knowledge. So even if the whole program was to be negotiated away, and I think that's a non-starter for the Iranians, but let's just assume hypothetically, if diplomatically you could negotiate away all of Iran's nuclear activities, or on the flip side, try to militarily destroy all of the different facilities that Iran has, theoretically speaking, the Iranians could just rebuild, and they would rebuild deeper, they would rebuild under more hardened facilities. So it's just a question of what state does the Iranian nuclear program have to be in, and how much transparency and visibility of the program does the international community need to have for the US and for other concerned parties to be confident that, we know enough of the program and it's capped enough that if there was a push towards weaponization, we have enough notice to actually be able to deal with it. So I think that's sort of the best we're going to get at. I don't think you're going to get a guarantee that Iran would never develop a nuclear weapon.
So let's review the bidding with the recent agreements, starting with the JCPOA, because that was, remind me, was that on Obama's watch originally? There was John Kerry was the emissary. Then Trump has one of his platforms was to get rid of that deal. And now it seems like sort of de facto that the tenets of what Witkoff is negotiating or what they're willing to allow gets kind of back to JCPOA. So remind us what JCPOA's tenets were and what the recent history of the American stance towards Iran having not just nuclear weapons, but a nuclear program is.
Sure. So the JCPOA was concluded in 2015 as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and it's quite an extensive document, but at its heart, really, it's a trade-off between putting caps on the Iranian nuclear program, putting limitations on its activities and stockpiles of fissile material, in exchange for some relief for Iran from US sanctions, UN sanctions, European Union sanctions. So that's sort of at the heart of the deal. In terms of how it limits the Iranian nuclear program, what it did is it set back what we call the breakout time of the Iranian nuclear program to, or rather extended it. It extended the breakout time to a year. So prior to the agreement, I think we were sitting at 2 to 3 months. And I should explain. So breakout time is the amount of time that it would take Iran to produce sufficient weapons-grade uranium. So that's uranium enriched to 90% uranium-235 isotope. So that's what you would need to include in a nuclear weapon. So breakout time is the amount of time that it would take Iran to accumulate sufficient enriched uranium, weapons-grade, for a single nuclear weapon. So before the JCPOA, the breakout time, if I'm not mistaken, was at about 2-3 months. And then the JCPOA had moved it to a year. It also then increased the transparency of the program. So Iran agreed to essentially open up more of its facilities to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the international watchdog for nuclear programs. But then it also included some other provisions that were specific to the JCPOA that increased the transparency of the program. When it comes to the reduction of the breakout time, just to go back to that, basically the tenets there were around reduction in the levels of enrichment. So Iran could not enrich past 3.67%. As I said, weapons grade is 90, so that's quite a far ways away. There was a cap on uranium stocks, enriched uranium stocks. So I think it was 300 kilograms of uranium hexafluoride that Iran could have. There was a limit on the number of centrifuges that Iran could use to enrich. So for those not familiar, those are kind of the big tubes that you might see in photos that are used to spin uranium to enrich it, to get it to those higher percentages of U-235. So there was a cap on those numbers. There was a limit in terms of the types of centrifuges that Iran could use. It could only have the most basic IR1 type centrifuge, which is really not very efficient. So it would take it a very, very long time to enrich sufficient enriched uranium using those models. There are a few other provisions, but those are kind of the key ones.
It's hard to segment the commercial from the weapons grade development. And to that point, you guys have a chart in your article that lists the major facilities in Iran. The Natanz fuel enrichment plant. What you can see here is this is way feet dry, so it's no minor trip from, let's say, Vinson and or Harry S. Truman are located in the North Arabian Sea, outside of the strait, pretty good distance. So this would be somewhere on the order of a 1,500-mile trip to get to that as a target. But you can see another facility, which is north of Natanz, all the way to the Kolong Mountains. This facility is there buried in the mountainside. So this is where it looks like they would do the weapons grade uranium development. This is where they're working on the military side of their nuclear program. The point with respect to American power projection is it's a long way to go. We're not talking about praying mantis kind of strikes against Bandar Abbas or the port facilities on the shoreline. We're talking about you've got to go really downtown. So let me segue from that fact into this chart you guys have. These are the weapons that the American inventory and the Israeli inventory, which is another interesting element that President Trump brought up. He's like, yeah, Israel would probably have the lead if we did a strike against Iran at this point. I don't think there's ever been a joint American-Israeli strike that I'm aware of. So that's an interesting phenomenon. Certainly, Israel has done strikes on their own, including the ones they did back in October, where they took out the Parchin Talagan facility. You can see a before and after here. And this is where they were working on, again, nuclear weapons development. This strike hit 20 targets, mostly aimed at their counter-ballistic missile. There was sort of a counter-ballistic missile in this. Remember, they were launching missiles at Israel at the time, and the Houthis were as well. So this was Israel's response using F-35s and their large drones. This particular target was hit by drones, not F-35s, because again, it's very close to Tehran. To bring up this table again, basically you guys do a nice job here of listing the potential weapons that would be used against these nuclear facilities. But as you also outline, some of this is going to be insufficient to completely get rid of their capability. The other thing to note is the Israelis did substantial damage with that Parchin strike back in October. They also were able to take out some of their S-300s, which is a big deal in terms of their integrated air defenses and threats to allied, let's just say, American forces in the event we were to do strikes against their nuclear facilities. So what do we think based on everything I just said?
So a couple of things. So in terms of, I guess, Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions, if you want to put it that way. So there's actually not been any confirmation from the U.S. intelligence community, and I've not seen one from the Israeli intelligence community either, I don't think, that confirms that a decision's been made to pursue nuclear weapons. I think the last that I've seen was a U.S. intelligence assessment that Iran is engaging in. I'm going to try to get the exact wording right, but it's engaging in activities that would better position it to pursue nuclear weapons capability if it decided to do so. So the activities at Parchin, as far as I understand, could have weapons-related relevance, but aren't necessarily part of a determined nuclear weapons program, because as far as we know, the Iranians don't actually have one. They've not made a decision to pursue nuclear weapons. And then to your point around the distinction between nuclear weapons technology versus the civilian nuclear program. So I would argue that in Iran's case, you could actually draw the line, if you wanted to, between what is credibly for civilian purposes versus what might have limited or no civilian nuclear energy applications in terms of their activities. So Iran does have a civilian nuclear program. They've got the Bushehr nuclear power plant. There's 2 more units under construction by the Russians at the moment at Bushehr, the plant there. So they do need nuclear fuel for those reactors. And they also have research reactors. You can use enriched uranium for medical isotopes, et cetera. So there are civilian applications for uranium enrichment. However, the level of enrichment that's required for nuclear reactor fuel is about 3 to 5%. So if you cap Iranian nuclear or Iranian uranium enrichment at 3.67, which is where it was under the JCPOA, that's still within that window of what they would need if they were going to produce fuel for the Bushehr nuclear power plant. When we're talking about 60% enrichment, which is where the Iranians are now, my understanding is that there are some civilian applications for 60% enriched uranium, namely for medical isotopes, but not at the level of stockpiles that they're stockpiling. So the E3, the UK, France, Germany have come out and said there's no civilian explanation for stockpiling those kinds of levels of uranium enriched to 60%. So you could actually draw the line if you wanted to between what is, like I said, credibly for civilian purposes potentially, and where you start running into issues around why are you enriching to 20 or 60% or amassing stockpiles of that kind. When it comes to your point around the difficulty of eliminating Iran's nuclear facilities, there's a few challenges, as you said. They're quite, first of all, they're dispersed across the country. So if you were going to try to fully eliminate the program, you'd have to hit quite a few facilities. It's not just Natanz and Fordow. There's significant facilities at Isfahan and Iraq. So they're all over the country. So you'd have to carry out quite a large air operation to target all of them. You then run into Iranian air defenses, which, yes, technically can be suppressed. But again, we're talking about at that point quite a significant military operation that you'd have to mount. As you mentioned, a number of them are deeply buried, and as we line out in our article, quite deep underground. So it would take several attempts at a single target to penetrate them. And that's assuming, probably incorrectly, that there are no blast doors inside, that there's not multiple entrances, exits, which there most likely are. So these are really, really complicated targets. There are a number of key targets that are above ground. So there's an enrichment facility at Natanz that's not underground. There's also a fuel fabrication plant in Isfahan that's, as far as I know, above ground. And I think the last that I'd seen reported, which was a couple of years ago now, a large volume of their enriched uranium stocks was kept at that facility, which is above ground. I don't know if that's still the case or not. So there are a couple of above ground, more than a couple, there are a few above ground facilities that one could target. But I think if you're going to really go after the heart of the nuclear program and incapacitate decisively Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons, if it decided to do that, you have to go over after the uranium enrichment capability itself, not just the stocks, and a large part of that is underground.
Were you guys talking about the analog from previous strikes that have taken out nuclear facilities? You mentioned they're dispersed already, but you also talk about in the article any comparisons with Israeli attacks against Iraq's Azarak reactor in 81 and Syria's Al-Kibar facility in 07 are highly misplaced. In both instances, the attack countries' programs were highly concentrated and in their nascent stage. As you said at the outset, they're pretty far down the road of a nuclear program, civilian or otherwise. Also, you said that those two, the Syrian and Iraqi programs, relied extensively on foreign assistance, and basically Iran is a smart country, a lot of higher education, a lot of engineers. So that makes their resilience greater than the previous two, because people could just go, well, look how quickly the Israelis took out the Iraqi capability. And so that's not quite true when you talk about Iran.
That's one of my pet peeves, to be honest, when people try to draw the comparison with Azarak or Al-Kibar, precisely for the reasons that you point out. This is a completely different situation, a completely different universe.
What do we think is going to happen as a result of the talks going on right now in Oman?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that a lot of people that work in the space are grappling with at the moment, both in terms of, well, are the Iranians actually ultimately pushing towards a nuclear weapon and this is just dragging it out? Or are they perhaps content with a threshold capability or a near threshold capability, which is what they have? And then also in terms of what could the United States, what could Europe put on the table that would convince Iran to roll back its program or to limit it in some way? And those are both very difficult questions to answer. But I think on the first one, personally, if I was the Iranians, I would think that they're sort of in a sweet spot now. If they start pushing towards actual weaponization, the Americans, the Israelis will almost certainly pick that up and through their intelligence gathering. And in that case, the Iranians are in a very, very vulnerable position because a single warhead or two warheads is not a very survivable deterrent capability. So I think they'd be worse off if they tried to push for a nuclear weapons capability. Whereas at the moment, they have a very advanced program. There's still the threat that they could push towards a nuclear weapons capability. And it's a sufficient threat that it brings the likes of the US, Russia, China, the Europeans to the table to try to figure out, okay, what can we give the Iranians? What concessions can we make so that they don't make the decision to push towards a nuclear weapon? So I actually think they're kind of in a sweet spot now. And I'm not convinced that they actually want to push towards a nuclear weapons capability. Their current threshold capability might be sufficient for what they need, which is to generate leverage to perhaps deter the Americans from greater involvement in the Middle East. And then in terms of what can be put on the table for the Iranians, this is a really, really difficult one. And this is where I think some of my skepticism around the potential for success of these current talks, that's where my skepticism comes in a bit, because the Iranians, at the end of the day, yes, they want to avoid a military escalation, which is what Iran said would follow if the diplomatic route doesn't work. But primarily, they want economic relief. That's always been the objective, is how do we get relief from sanctions? The Iranian economy is heavily, heavily sanctioned. It has been for decades. It's under sanctions from the US. It's under sanctions from the European Union. There are still some restrictions at the UN Security Council level, although quite limited. So it wants some relief, primarily, I would assume, from European and US sanctions. But how do you credibly provide that? That's very difficult. So when the JCPOA was agreed in 2015, there was some lifting of US secondary sanctions. There was lifting of European Union and UN Security Council sanctions. And there was some injection of business and investment into the country. But then once the Americans pulled out in 2018, once the last Trump administration pulled out of the agreement, and US secondary sanctions were reimposed, no business wanted to do business in Iran, because they would then be, even non-American businesses, they would be exposing themselves potentially to secondary sanctions from the United States. And if you're a bank, if you're a business, why would you want to risk that? The Iranian economy is probably not that lucrative for most businesses. So the Europeans had tried to provide some kind of economic benefit to Iran, with the US no longer being in the agreement and with secondary sanctions imposed, but they really, really struggled. And in the end, that's why the Iranians started rolling back their compliance with the agreement as well and started violating parts of it. So how do you credibly put forward economic incentives when I say we, I mean the Americans, the Europeans, when we've struggled to credibly deliver the economic benefit that Iran has wanted in the past? I think that's a really difficult one, because, even if the US was to lift some secondary sanctions, you can't force the private sector to go into an economy that they don't want to go into. There are other sanctions in place that are not related to the nuclear question, right? So the Europeans have human rights sanctions against Iran. They have sanctions against Iran related to Iran's support of Russia's war effort. So the Americans certainly have a whole myriad of sanctions on the Iranian economy. So even if you were to lift some nuclear-related sanctions, it's still a very heavily sanctioned economy, which businesses are going to be wary to go into. And the Iranians are very aware of that. So I think the question now, and it's been the question in past negotiations as well, is the Iranians want some kind of guarantees that, number one, they're going to get the economic benefit that they expect, but also that the Americans won't pull out again. How do you provide those guarantees? Big question mark. And if the Iranians don't get those guarantees, then what's keeping them at the table? which for me raises the possibility that this might be just a play for time. Although, I have heard the Iranians are quite keen to see what they can get in terms of economic benefit in the next few months. So maybe I'm wrong.
Well, certainly the dynamic has shifted a bit in recent months since the fall of Assad, Hezbollah being targeted by Israel. We talked about this in the last episode. And reportedly, they've pulled all their advisors out of Western Yemen, the advisors to the Houthis. So maybe their willingness to not just have a dialogue, a direct dialogue, insofar as it is direct. I think they talked once directly. The rest was through proxies, there in Muscat, but they're in the same place. They're trying to work forward. But maybe the Iranian willingness to negotiate is been enhanced by the developments in recent months. The other thing to prognosticate, since I'm a military channel here, is the likelihood of American power projection into Iran. Right. So we had the build up, and I like to talk about, you kind of reach this point of no return like we do with Desert Storm. It's like, well, we're here. We might as well do a war, and so we're not at the Desert Storm level of gear in the region, but we certainly did ramp up by a couple 100% between the extra carrier strike group and the stuff we put on Diego Garcia. So what I'm thinking, based on the existence of these direct talks and what you're saying, is the likelihood of strikes from American forces in the coming weeks is lower than maybe it would have been a few weeks ago. Would you agree with that?
I think politically it would be quite hard for the US at the moment to commit any more military resources to the region, considering the desire to pull back. Strikes on Iranian facilities wouldn't require a ground operation. You could carry those out through airstrikes. But again, you're in such a situation of escalatory risk at that point that I think it would have to be a serious consideration. And this wouldn't be a surgical strike, most likely.
No, I think that's right. So we'll see if these negotiations break down and the Houthis continue their mayhem, then I think we would see, let's just call it, to use your words, a surgical strike on the port facilities, in the littorals. So Bandar Abbas, Chabahar, those kinds of places. And this is why I teed up just how far the nuclear facilities are from the Persian Gulf or the North Arabian Sea. I don't think we're going downtown, even with drones or TLAM. If you had asked me last week, when Vincent gets on station, are we ready to start going feet dry? I would have said, yeah, maybe. But since the developments in Oman and the reaction to the Houthis losing Iranian support, reportedly, I think it's less so. So that's good. I like it when presence equals deterrence. That was kind of the hallmark of my time in the Navy. And that's kind of why we have an over-the-horizon Navy. But we will be on the case. So, Darya, we will turn to you in the future when this sort of thing comes up again. So thanks for joining us with your expertise today.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.